The uptick in numbers has hit close to home here as well. The leader of the Bloc Québécois, Yves-François Blanchet, and all of his MPs are in self-isolation, after a staff member and Blanchet's wife tested positive for COVID-19. And Conservative Party leader Erin and his family are also in self-isolation after a staff member who travels with O'Toole tested positive. In a week, parliamentarians are still scheduled to come back here, back to Parliament for the throne speech. It's still unclear what the fall session will look like. Normally, all 338 MPs would sit in the House of Commons, but it's been operating under a hybrid model during the pandemic until Parliament was prorogued.
Everywhere across the country, people need to be careful, people need to be vigilant, people need to be attentive, people need to be listening to the best recommendations of public health, which obviously means having 338 MPs converge on Ottawa from every corner of the country is probably not what we'd want to see from our leadership in this country.
And I would encourage all leaders of opposition parties to really consider the ability to vote virtually, because I think this is a problem that's going to be with us for a while, and we certainly have a number of options on the table for opposition parties in terms of continuing Parliament through a hybrid model that includes voting.
So how do the latest developments with Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Blanchet affect how Parliament might work next week? Arif Virani is Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice. He joins us from Toronto. Karen Vecchio is the Conservatives' Deputy House Leader. She joins us from Alliston, Ontario. Peter Julian is the NDP's House Leader, and he joins us from New Westminster in beautiful British Columbia. Hello to all three of you. Thank you very much for making time for us this evening.
Good to see you.
Mr. Virani, I'm going to start with you. A week from today, Parliament is set to return. We still don't know what exactly that's going to look like. The Prime Minister today said that your party will move ahead with a hybrid scenario. I just wanted to get some details from you on what exactly that looks like, and have plans changed given what we've heard about the Bloc leader and other Bloc MPs who are self-isolating and the leader of the Conservatives, Erin O'Toole, who is also self-isolating right now in pending a test.
So first thing I want to say is, in respect of Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Blanchet, that we wish them both well, them and their entire caucuses and the staff that are supporting them, as well as the Parliamentary Protective Service officers tested positive. It just underscores the gravity of the situation and the pandemic that we're still very much in the middle of. In terms of sort of answering your question, Vashi, what I can say to you is that we've announced, obviously there's been a prorogation. We've announced the 23rd is the date for the throne speech. We're moving ahead with planning and setting the agenda for the forthcoming session and for the forthcoming Parliament. And it is an ambitious agenda that's based on what we've learned from COVID and a resetting of certain priorities, addressing vulnerabilities, thinking about a green recovery, et cetera. But what would it look like? I mean, I think Canadians can take their best cue from what the hybrid Parliament looked like over the past several months. That's tended to work well. One missing piece is obviously the voting piece, because we hadn't been actively voting, and getting to a point where we can reach consensus among the parties on how to cast a ballot from places like New Westminster or Alliston or Toronto would be very beneficial in order to allow parliamentarians to execute all of their duties as parliamentarians.
So I just want to back up for a second. Does that mean that there are going to be 86 MPs physically present and that there will be a hybrid model, as we saw, as you mentioned, during the summer? I just want to be clear.
So what we were very much thinking is that at this stage, I think most Canadians would agree, having 338 parliamentarians congregate on the 23rd in Ottawa would not be in anyone's best interest, let alone all of the support staff that help us do our work as parliamentarians. So having some reduced number in Parliament in person, but having others participating virtually and giving them the full panoply of abilities to participate, including the ability to vote, because obviously the throne speech will trigger a confidence vote. And we'd very much like to see, for example, if all of the Bloc caucus, there's 31 MPs who I'm sure want to cast a ballot on that confidence motion, we want to ensure that they're able to do so, and the path forward would likely be working towards online voting of some kind.
Ms. Vecchio, I do want to get into a discussion in a second about the prospect of distance voting or online voting, whatever we decide to call it. But I wanted to just touch base with you about your party's stance on how many MPs basically should be in Parliament. I know that I was listening to a discussion on the weekend on the House with my colleague Chris Hall, in which the number 86 was again put forward. Has that number changed at all for your party? Like, given the amount of people who have fallen ill, given the staff member of the Parliamentary Protective Service, is there any concern that even that might be too many?
Well, absolutely. All of those things have to be taken into consideration. But first and foremost, we do not want to send all 338 members of Parliament back. We know that that would not be safe. And we have to make sure that we're taking all of the necessary precautions, just as we've been doing so. And so we are looking at the other options that will be available. We put forward some suggestions and will continue to negotiate with the other parties to see how can we best represent all Canadians across the board, for people who aren't able to travel in to the House of Commons and for those who are able to do so as well. So we are looking at a mix as well, and I'm happy to continue to discuss and negotiate with all parties.
Mr. Julian, your party was initially kind of sounding the alarm about this a few weeks ago because the committee that had originally studied this was one of the committees that, by way of Parliament being prorogued, stopped its work or wasn't able to test a lot of the stuff that had been proposed or enable that kind of testing. Has your party come up with a very specific sort of ask or, I guess, idea of what you would like to see as far as the ratio of those in person versus not in person?
Yes, we have. But I'd like to start off by expressing all the best for Mr. O'Toole, Mr. Blanchet, and their families, and the staff for both the Bloc Québécois and the Conservative Party. And hopefully, we will have as many negative tests as possible. But it is concerning, and we wish them all the best. In a pandemic, it is the worst possible news to hear of a positive diagnosis. What we've been doing since Mr. Trudeau unilaterally prorogued Parliament and shut down all the committees is thinking ahead to the 23rd and pressing the Speaker to do the testing that's required and pressing all parties to come on board with a hybrid system that allows socially distanced voting in the House of Commons, and that could be 70, 80 members, but also allows members of Parliament to participate from across the country, because the reality is it's not just the fact that all MPs could be in the House, which would surely lead to a propagation and amplification of the virus. It's also the travel. Members of Parliament sometimes go through 3 or 4 airports between their home constituency and Ottawa. And so the reality is, if one member of Parliament catches COVID-19 and gives it to other members of Parliament, those members of Parliament could be spreading it into their constituents. And we have a responsibility to follow the best public health advice, which is why we've been pressing for a virtual way of voting. So we have full parliamentary powers, the full ability of Parliament to act as our democratic foundation. And at the same time, we're doing absolutely nothing that could help to promote the virus or spread the virus.
Mr. Virani, where are we when it comes to figuring out how distanced or electronic voting might work? And what level of responsibility does your government bear for kind of shutting things down while a committee was trying to figure out how that might go ahead?
So in respect to the first question, Vashi, I think we're actually closer than we think. When Parliament shifted into the West Bloc from Centre Bloc, all of the tools, equipment, et cetera, were put in place into the chamber to facilitate electronic voting. So that's one. But the notion of sort of how to do that remotely from one's home constituency around the country has also been carefully studied and looked at. We've already had a number of sessions of virtual Parliament where people have used parliamentary devices which are secured on secured servers, et cetera, with all of the protocols required to ensure that there's no access or interference or hacking that's possible. So I think we're much closer than many might have presumed at this point to being able to empower voting online. And with respect to your second question, I'll say to you exactly what the Prime Minister said and many cabinet ministers have said, is that we're coming out of a pandemic that is literally the most significant event since World War II in this country. And this pandemic has taught us a number of things about what has worked and what isn't working in Canada, and it has caused a lot of navel gazing in terms of the priorities that need to be reorganized from all of those mandate letters that the Prime Minister gave to his 30 some odd cabinet ministers back in October of last year. That's an important introspective exercise. It's important for Canadians to know what we're planning for in terms of the build back, to address concerns that Peter shares with respect to the green recovery, Karen shares with respect to employment and getting people back to work and their economic livelihoods restored. That's an important exercise that we want to put to Canadians via the throne speech. That is the reason for the prorogation. The committee work that Peter mentioned will resume, and we look forward to it resuming, and the committees exercising that accountability and oversight function that they do well in Parliament.
Yeah, Mr. Vreni, I'm not trying to take away from any of the introspection that needs to be done, but that committee was very specifically looking at this very issue that we don't really, I mean, I know there's discussions occurring right now, but we don't really have any resolve on. Let me quickly ask Ms. Vecchio, my apologies. You heard from Mr. Vrani there that he senses that actually voting, distance voting, electronic voting isn't necessarily so far off. Do you share that sense?
Well, part of my greatest concern is it has never been tested. And we also want to make sure there is accountability to Canadians. You know, when I vote, I want to make sure that I can face the 116,000 constituents that I have and share how I voted. And I think that's very important as well. The most important thing is being accountable to our constituents and to Canadians. So first of all, it hasn't been tested, so we don't know. And it just sweeping left and right should not be necessarily the way that we show the important work that we're doing, just something as simple as that. So I think we need to look at all the options that are available and make sure that they are 100% non-hackable and that they're very fair. And so we have to make sure those people who are not safe to travel, as both Peter and Arif have said, it's really important that we take those things into consideration. We do not want people traveling across this country all over, putting other people in jeopardy and at risk. And so we have to look at all of these things. So we'll just continue to negotiate and make sure we get the fairest plan for all.
When you say swiping left to right, though, is that at all, I guess, diminishing what's being put forward, or I heard one of your colleagues on the House again use that as an analogy, kind of as Tinder. I mean, there has been a lot of work done already by PROC on this and how it might work.
But one of the biggest things that hasn't been done is the actual testing. We don't know what this is. And we're talking about a throne speech that's going to be delivered in a week, where we're expecting in 2 weeks to be able to vote. We don't have that ability because of the shutdown of Parliament. We haven't had that ability to move forward. So I think it'd be very irresponsible for us to put something forward if we don't know how it's going to work.
So I guess that leaves us, Mr. Julian, with what ends up happening when the throne speech, as the Prime Minister says, will certainly go, and I know not right away, but will go to a confidence vote. If there isn't agreement on moving forward with electronic voting or with distance voting, I mean, how does that vote take place? Certainly, as you've all expressed, not everyone can be in the House.
Well, I think there's actually two doors. The first door is using the Zoom technology that we've already been using this summer, as you know, for question periods and for discussions and debates in the House of Commons. I think we're close to agreement on that, quite frankly. And I sent a letter this morning to the Speaker asking him to fully test this so that it's available to all of us by next week. Where the parties may not be in agreement yet is on the issue of voting application, which is different than using what we're already comfortable with. And I think for the important speech from the throne and the legislative initiatives that need to come forward, as you know, CERB ends in just over a week, and the government has not yet tabled the legislation that is supposed to take over from the emergency response benefit. We need to tackle that immediately. So those votes, I think, can be put into place through our existing technology that the Speaker, I believe, is willing to test. For a voting application, I think we may get consensus later. Where we don't want to go is have votes in the House of Commons where it's a majority vote on changing the voting system. I think it can be done through consensus. And quite frankly, over the last 6 months, the parties have found consensus repeatedly around issues. I think that's actually a strength of our Canadian democracy, is that the people have put their differences aside and we've all worked for the common good. And I think we can do the same for a Zoom vote that can take place as early as next week.
Okay, I'll leave it there. All three of you have given us a lot to think about over the next week. I appreciate your time very much. Arif Farani, Karen Vecchio, and Peter Julian. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.